Okay, so today's video is essentially the very end of section 4A and section 4B of the specification for Earth-Eye support systems. So the end of 4A is this bit here about the impact of long-term climate change on water and carbon cycles. So you'll have heard about these things in the news. We've sort of touched on them in lessons. So what are the impacts on the water and carbon cycles of climate change, the sort of climate change we're causing? So global warming can increase evaporation, and this can be the beginning of a positive feedback loop. So how could increased evaporation lead to a positive feedback loop, which is an amplification of change? So water vapour in the atmosphere is a greenhouse gas. As more water is evaporated, that will result in there being more water vapour in the atmosphere, and so this creates a positive feedback loop as it leads to warming and therefore leads to more evaporation. Further implications: more precipitation will mean more runoff and more flooding, which is going to be a result of more evaporation. The water vapour releases latent heat upon condensation, so we covered that when we looked at cloud formation. Which means there's going to be more energy in the atmosphere, more storms, things like that. It also melts ice sheets and shrinks the cryosphere. So that's the positive feedback loop. How could increased evaporation also lead to a negative feedback loop? So we get evaporation. What then happens to some of that water vapour, which could actually reduce the effect of climate change? So what you could get is cloud formation, and clouds will reflect a lot of the sun's energies. Clouds have a very high albedo. So clouds currently reflect about 1/5 of the sun's energy, and if we had more cloud, that would reflect even more, and so that would then negate the change. So there is positive and negative feedback loops, both of which can be considered, and as I've often said, your feedback loops are often mentioned in the higher levels of the mark scheme when it comes to answering exam questions. So understanding and use of feedback loops and explanations is a really good thing to practice and be strong on. So climate change on the carbon cycles is a little bit more complicated. It's a little bit less well understood. So this depends on both the rising temperatures and things like regional variation in rainfall. So, for example, the rainforest will be affected in a way that is different to temperate regions. So higher global temperature will increase decomposition. So in the rainforest, that could be really important in terms of cycling nutrients much more rapidly. But in the humid tropics, climate change may lead to increased aridity, so becoming more arid, more like a desert. So what we could face is loss of the tropical rainforest, at least to some degree. And again, that is a positive feedback loop. So the tropical rainforest plays an important role in photosynthesizing carbon and removing it from the atmosphere. If some of it becomes lost due to aridity, then that is going to affect the process. So boreal forests, these are the ones high up in the northern hemisphere. So these are the ones that encircle the North Pole or in the northern parts of Russia. So what's going to happen to those forests? It's getting warmer. What's going to happen to the Arctic ice, and therefore what might happen to these forests? Well, as the ice begins to melt and it gets warmer in the north, they will begin to be able to move towards the poles, because the only thing that's stopping them moving towards the poles at the moment is the temperature. And if it warms up, they will be able to grow towards the pole. And this could form a bit of a negative feedback loop in the sense that they will absorb CO2, and that will reduce the climate change. On the other hand, though, the loss of ice is a major positive feedback loop, because the ice has a very high albedo, and as we lose the ice, the Earth will absorb more energy because the forest will be a much more absorbent surface to energy. So there's all kinds of positive and negative feedback loops which could occur, and there's not one single answer as to exactly what's going to happen. And the challenge and the important thing is for you to be able to discuss the different ideas and evaluate which is most significant, why, that kind of thing. So permafrost up in the north, what will happen to the permafrost? How will the oceans be affected? Well, first of all, permafrost, that will begin to melt. The undecomposed organic matter held within it will start to decompose. That will release CO2 and CH4 into the atmosphere and cause a positive feedback loop. Oceans, so we've got acidification because of atmospheric carbon diffusing into the ocean. This is going to impact the phytoplankton, as we talked about last time. So phytoplankton doesn't like it as it gets more acidic. Phytoplankton photosynthesize more carbon than the tropical rainforest. So this is, again, another positive feedback loop occurring. So in the long term, climate change is going to result in even more carbon in the atmosphere and less carbon in the biospheres and the oceans. And this is going to vary from region to region. It's also going to affect things like rates of photosynthesis and decomposition of respiration. And again, this will vary from region to region. So it depends on if an area becomes more arid, if it becomes wetter. So if an arid region starts to experience more rainfall, we're actually going to see photosynthesis happening there more and more plant growth and things like that. So have a go at this question. So based on what we've just looked at there, do you agree that climate change is going to affect the carbon cycle more or the water cycle more? So this should only be it should be about 15 minutes. That's the amount of time you would have in the exam for a 10-mark question. Okay, so it's using the information that we've just done. Which of the two cycles is affected most? So as I mentioned during the slides, use of feedback loops is really important for earning the high mark. So try and get a feedback loop into your answer. Try and express the significance of changes to the carbon and water cycle by discussing the causation of a feedback loop. Obviously, we can't swap our answers with a partner, but not to worry. So now we're on to section 4B. So we're on the sort of home straight to the end of the topic. This section now is all about management strategies to protect the global carbon cycle. Okay, they're sometimes referred to as global strategies, things like that. But we're going to look at a range of ways in which we can try as humans to reduce our effect on the carbon cycle. So essentially ways in which we can be more green, be more eco-friendly, things like that. And this little section is a nice sort of self-contained section which is really good for being asked exam questions on. So basically you're going to be presented with several different methods by which we can protect the carbon cycle, and you could very easily be asked to evaluate which is the best and why. And so it's kind of a good thing to have a strong handle on and to practice. So first of all, we've got some pictures which are a bit of a clue potentially to some of these methods. So you may be able to see from some of these what you think's going on. So have a look at the pictures and see what kind of methods are we looking at. So we have wetland restoration, afforestation, which is the opposite of deforestation, sustainable agricultural practices, and then controls on greenhouse emissions through international agreements. So we'll have a look at these. So first of all, wetlands. So a wetland is exactly like it sounds. It is an area of land that is wet. It can be freshwater or salt water. So we get saltwater marshes in Norfolk, so up on the coast, lots of reeds, and the ground is very boggy and wet, and that stores a lot of carbon. You also often more higher up on hills get peatlands. You get floodplains, so these will be quite common in places like Lincolnshire, places where there's lots of flooding. And then in more tropical areas, you get mangroves as well. All these have the same thing in common, which is that the water table, as in where the saturated ground starts, is pretty much at the ground surface, which is why as you walk on it, it's extremely wet. And so you'd need to wear sort of boots or something to not get soaking wet feet. So this is a mangrove, in case any of you sort of aren't familiar with the concept. So it's this really dense forest along the coast. So it happens often in tropical areas. It's been featured in some David Attenborough documentaries. So there's one of the Planet Earths with a sloth on an island, and it's kind of looking for a mate, I think, and it swims from one island to another. Well, it's climbing around in mangroves, and these are actually really effective in a lot of ways in terms of this forest is right on the coastline, so it helps protect against erosion, it helps protect against large waves and storms, and it also stores a lot of carbon within it, so that's just sort of the nature of how it works. So this is another example of a wetland, in case we're sort of unfamiliar with what we're talking about. Exactly like we say, the water table essentially at ground level. And so restoring these sites, restoring these wetlands, many of which have been drained, as we talked about in a previous lesson, for the purposes of farming or urbanization, both here and in America and lots of other countries. This has happened extensively. So we dig deep ditches and we pump water off the land, and then we can farm on it and things like this. This has caused lots of carbon to be released from the soil into the atmosphere, and restoration reverses that process. So it captures a lot of carbon from the atmosphere and naturally stores it in a sustainable long-term way. Okay, there's a video here that you can watch about wetland restoration. So you can pause this video and watch this about wetland restoration to add the information from that to your notes. Okay, so it's got some good examples about wetland restoration. So why do we worry about wetlands? Well, they are between 6 and 9% of the surface of the planet, but they also account for 35% of the carbon stored in the terrestrial area, so that's on land. So despite being only 6 to 9% of the whole surface of the land, it's 35% of the carbon, which means that it's really pulling its weight as a land use in terms of storing carbon. That's a huge amount more than the average amount of carbon stored on land, isn't it, if it's 35% compared to 6 to 9%. In what we refer to as the lower 48 US states, or the contiguous United States, so those are basically all of the United States apart from Alaska and Hawaii, which aren't connected directly with the mainland United States. The amount of wetland has shrunk by half since 1600. So I think, any ideas why that might have happened? What sorts of things have occurred since 1600 in America that could have led to loss of wetlands? Well, this is around the time that America was settled by Europeans, and since then we've had massive population growth, and we've had an awful lot of farming and urbanization and economic development, and people have spread out across the land and claimed sections of land and drained it so that they can grow crops and things like that. So you may have heard at times in sort of political discussions, if you ever watch these sorts of things on the news, people like Donald Trump referring to places like Washington as the swamp. And in his election sort of campaigning, he kept referring to, that he was going to drain the swamp and things like this. Well, he's calling it that because it literally was a swamp. They drained wetland areas to build Washington. The same is true in large amounts of New York. So Manhattan was like a wetland, and again was drained to build the city. So yeah, large areas of America had wetlands, and they've since been destroyed and removed for people to live. And this creates all kinds of issues, both for the water cycle and the carbon cycle. So we're looking kind of primarily at the importance of the wetland for the carbon cycle. They store a lot of carbon, but they also play a really important role in storing water and slowing its progress through the drainage basin. So if you have a wetland, then when it rains, the wetland can hold a lot of water in surface storage, and it prevents it just flowing rapidly into a river and heading off downstream and potentially flooding further downstream. When we remove the wetland and we cause the water to rapidly drain into ditches that then flow into rivers, that can create much higher levels of flooding, and that's part of the reason why we experience such high levels of flooding in the UK and in other countries, because of the way that we've removed things like wetlands and forests, which would naturally slow the water. So we also lose biodiversity. It also, as we destroy it, as I mentioned in the carbon cycle, it releases carbon dioxide. It also releases methane. Okay, so wetland restoration. So by restoring the wetland, we are then going to be able to store carbon in the wetland. So in Canada's prairie provinces, which are the central provinces in the middle of the country, they've lost 70% of their wetland area due to the reasons we've already talked about. Now, each hectare or 100 metres square of this wetland stores 3.25 tonnes of carbon per year. Okay, Canada is looking at restoring 112,000 hectares of carbon. That's their goal. Okay, so this has the potential, if we sort of times the amount of carbon stored by the area, we get the amount of sequestration that could occur each year. Now this is looks very impressive, over 350,000 tonnes per year. It's certainly not a bad thing, and it's a great example of a management strategy. But if we take that figure and we compare it to the amount of carbon being emitted every year by people in general, then it's obviously a very small amount. And even if we compare it to just the amount of carbon being emitted by Canada, it's quite a small amount. Okay, so it's good to have that context. It's good to kind of consider it compared to other figures that we're aware of. So this is less than 500,000 tonnes of carbon a year, and we know that land use emits 1 billion tonnes of carbon, or land use change emits 1 billion tonnes of carbon each year. So it's good to bear all that in mind. There's another video you can watch here again to get some additional notes on wetland restoration. So you've got it as a really strong example that you could use in an exam. So some further examples. The UK had a lot of wetlands, and these have also been largely destroyed. A lot of these were in the east of England. So in Cambridgeshire, which is also in the east of England, they have targeted 400 hectares of farmland to be converted back to wetlands. They're also trying to do something similar in Somerset. And so the UK is aiming for 500 hectares of wetland by 2020. Now, compared to the Canadian example, I think it's fair to say that's a really small amount. So in terms of evaluation, we can introduce this as an example and say, look, this is something that is being done, and we've got examples in Canada and the UK. But particularly if we look at the UK example, obviously the UK is much smaller than Canada, but this is a very small amount of land realistically. So it doesn't show a high level of commitment to using this approach to trying to reduce climate change. So how it works, in terms of restoration, it's all about trying to raise the water table. So to drain the wetland originally, what the people would have done is put methods in place to try and lower the water table. So what we essentially have to do is remove those processes to try and raise the water table again. So rivers may have been diverted, so we can reconnect those rivers. We can do things like breaching coastal defences to cause sea flooding. To drain the land, they would have dug ditches to drain the water. So if you block those ditches, that will help cause the water table to raise. Okay, so all of those are the ways that wetlands can be restored. Now we're on to afforestation, the planting of trees basically. So tree planting in previously deforested areas. So we touched on this in the rainforest example. So trees are a great carbon sink, so very good way of storing a lot of carbon. Also, they have the benefits for the water cycle of reducing flood risk, reducing soil erosion, and lots of other things we saw in the rainforest example. Okay, so we've got the RED scheme. So this is the UN Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and Forest Degradation scheme. So this puts a monetary value on forests. This incentivises lower income developing countries to conserve them. There's also projects in the Amazon and the Mississippi. China has a very big project where it's aiming to afforest 400,000 kilometres square of land by 2050, and they've already done 30,000 in the first decade of this century. The main reason they're doing this is to try and combat desertification. So they're doing it not actually to do with climate change, they're doing it to manage the land, but that doesn't mean it doesn't serve a good purpose, and it's actually almost preferable if there's multiple reasons why you want to afforest. So if you've got a whole range of benefits that are coming from afforestation, that will then mean that the likelihood of the project succeeding is much higher. Whereas if the only reason you're doing it is to try and reduce climate change, that might cause the project to get derailed for some reason because there's less people behind it. Sustainable agriculture. So the big issue with agriculture is overcultivation, growing too many crops, and overgrazing, so grazing too many animals. Also, excessive intensification. So this is using too many chemicals, so things like fertilizers and pesticides and things like this. All of this damages the soil. And the soil, as we learned in a previous lesson, is a living thing. It contains organisms, and damaging it causes carbon to be released. Okay, so when we also do intensive livestock farming, this creates huge amounts of methane from the livestock, from things like the cows. So this creates 100 million tonnes of carbon each year. Also important are rice paddies. So we'll look at a picture of these shortly. So and uncontrolled decomposition of manure. So this is a rice paddy. So you can see just over here they're growing the rice there. So these to grow rice you have to flood fields like they've done here. So they've built these terraces. These are sort of walls that the farmers have built. And so they have these shallow fields which are flooded. And what this basically means is that the organic matter that's on the field decomposes anaerobically in the absence of oxygen. And so it produces a lot of methane. So this may not seem like a big deal, but rice is the staple food of an awful lot of people around the world. And so a lot of rice is grown, and this does actually release an awful lot of methane. So to solve this, it basically means trying to use more sustainable practices on the land. Things like what's called zero tillage. So tillage is ploughing, so turning the field over, turning the soil on the field over. And there are ways of growing crops without doing this. And this is beneficial because it reduces the amount of carbon being released. So when you plough the field, you turn the top layer of soil over. And when you do that, you expose soil deeper down in the earth to the air. And this causes decomposition of organic material that is in that soil. And so it releases carbon into the atmosphere. So zero tillage avoids that. So this does require specialist equipment, which is expensive, and farmers may want to avoid doing that because it is expensive. Also, tilling actually has purposes. We don't do it for no reason. So it helps remove the weeds. So as you turn the top layer of soil over, it buries the weeds. And so those can outcompete crops. And if you don't use tillage, then it might mean that farmers are encouraged then to use chemicals to deal with the weeds. Another approach is what's called polyculture. So poly means multiple as opposed to mono, which means one. So polyculture is growing different crops interspersed with trees. So by having the trees, they protect the soil. So the trees are there all year round. So you might remove the crops for several months of the year as you harvest, but the trees remain, and so they protect the soil from wind and rain and things like this. Now the disadvantage of this is that as a farmer, what you want is a nice empty, ideally square field or rectangular field that you can drive your tractor up and down in without any interruptions. Start planting trees in it, and all of a sudden it's an awful lot harder to drive up and down and plough your field and harvest the crops. So this might mean that farming is more labour intensive or takes longer, and that comes with its own negatives. So if you have to use the tractor more, tractors burn a huge amount of fuel. So if you're having to spend more time in the field with the tractor, that in itself is going to emit a lot of carbon. So there's a positive and negative to a lot of these ideas and these potential solutions. Another one is what's called crop residue. So these are the sort of stems and leaves. You can leave these in the field to provide a bit of cover to the ground to stop it eroding, stop it drying out. And just trying to reduce machinery use as much as possible, particularly when the soil is wet, which is when it's most vulnerable. And again, going back to this, if we're planting trees, that means we're probably going to actually use machinery more. And so that will damage the soil through compaction and things like that. Okay, so it's a real balance between these different options. Something to do with kind of protecting the field from loss of soil through erosion is what's called contour ploughing. So a contour is like what you see on a map where you've got the contour lines and they show you a consistent height across the map. Down here on the bottom right, this person has done contour ploughing. It means they've ploughed along the contours of the field. So you can see where the person has ploughed along like this. So the hill goes sort of up and down this way, and they've basically ploughed across it. Whereas this person on the left here is ploughing up and down the hill. Now, the problem with ploughing up and down the hill, like this person on the left is doing, is when it rains, the water will run down these furrows and wash soil away with it, and that damages the soil. Obviously, it erodes the soil. Whereas here on the right, the water will flow down the hill and it will get caught in the areas that have been ploughed, and it will then infiltrate into the ground, so less water will run off and less soil will be removed. So that's contour ploughing and why it helps protect the soil and also the water cycle. Another thing that can be done to, again, protect the soil and stop water running off so rapidly is what's called terracing. These are all man-made, so the people have created these terraces. It's very labour intensive, as you might imagine. But on steep hills, it allows for crops to be grown. And it also reduces the flow of water. So water obviously wants to flow downhill like this, and it's going to infiltrate as it lands on each terrace rather than flowing off down the hill. Some other things we can do in terms of sustainable agriculture are things like there are new strains of rice which prefer dry conditions. So rather than having paddy fields, you can grow them without paddy fields, which then reduces how much CO2 is emitted. There's also a material called ammonium sulfate, which reduces microbial activities. So that can be added to fields, which can help, therefore, reduce the problem of methane production. So why might farmers not wish to do this? What might put them off using these new solutions that we've been suggesting? Well, the main reason that farmers have been farming the way they have is because that is probably the most efficient and cheapest way to do it. And if you ask them to start taking on these new practices, they may be time consuming and they may end up using vehicles more. All of these things cost money. Okay, time costs money, using the tractor costs money, investing in new strains of rice costs money. So all of these things add up, and so unless you're going to start paying the farmers to encourage them to do this, then it's unlikely they're going to be willing to take these steps. Some solutions with regard to livestock, so we can improve the feed of animals. This reduces what's called enteric fermentation. This means basically producing gases within the cow, and it reduces its burping and farting. So we mix the inhibitors in with the animal's feed, and this reduces how much methane they produce. We can also manage their manure better. So manure can be stored in what's called an anaerobic container. So this is a container without any oxygen, and you can capture the CH4, the methane, as it comes off, and then use that as a source of energy by burning it. Okay. Again, all of these approaches require money. They require investment. So unless we're going to bring in laws that say farmers have to do this, or we pay farmers to do it, it's unlikely they're going to do it willingly, because they're not going to be making enough money off their sales of their crops to cover it. Just to cover this manure management, this is an anaerobic digester. So this is a sealed vessel, and what we do is we put manure in here, and in the absence of oxygen, the manure breaks down, and so the carbon in the manure combines with hydrogen to form CH4, to form methane. We then remove the biogas over here, and we can collect that and put it in bottles and use it for energy. So methane is a perfectly normal sort of natural gas that we use for energy. You also get what's called effluent, which is a liquid waste coming out. So this liquid waste is something you can use on fields as a bit of a fertilizer, as a compost, which is completely natural and organic. So this is a really good way of managing manure and reducing our impact on the carbon cycle. The problem obviously is that this thing here, this costs money to install. So it's got to be worth the farmer's while to do this. So he's got to maybe be able to sell the gas for enough money to cover the cost of the anaerobic digester. Okay, the next option is international agreements. Okay, so this is where a lot of countries around the world agree to essentially a contract on how much carbon they are going to emit over a set period. Okay, so these agreements, the reason we need them is that global warming affects everybody. It doesn't only punish those who are perpetrators. So America produces a lot of CO2. That doesn't mean that America will be the ones who suffer the most from global warming. In fact, it's unlikely they will be. It will be countries that are much more low-lying. Countries like the Maldives and Bangladesh, which are very close to sea level, these are the countries that are going to suffer the most and the most quickly. Okay, so back in 1997, we had the Kyoto Protocol. So Kyoto is a city in Japan. And they always have these interesting kind of names. So Kyoto Protocol, we had the Paris Accord, things like this, okay? This was a legally binding agreement that basically wealthy countries agreed to reduce their CO2 emissions. So developing countries were exempt from it. It was seen that places like China and India, that it would be unfair to limit their CO2 production because they were still developing, and it would feel a bit like wealthy countries have sort of climbed up the ladder of development and then pulled it up behind them and stopped other countries following in their footsteps. So the goal of the Kyoto Protocol was that countries needed to reduce their climate. So the goal of the Kyoto Protocol was that countries needed to reduce their carbon emissions to 1990 levels by 2012. So they have until the year 2012 to get their emissions down to the same level they were in 1990. Okay, so this is the first step in trying to reduce carbon emissions. So the USA and Australia did not what's called ratify the agreement. What that means is the negotiators go to the agreement and they negotiate on behalf of their country, but they're not actually the government of the country. Then the agreement is brought back to the country and it has to go through whatever parliament system that they have. And in America and in Australia, it was not agreed by the parliaments. This was a bit like, if you remember when there was the Brexit negotiations going on, the Brexit negotiators would form a deal with the EU, and then that would have to try and go through Parliament, and many times it did not go through Parliament. So Theresa May had a deal, but people wouldn't vote on it, so then she ended up no longer being Prime Minister because of that. So, do you think Kyoto was a success based on this? The answer, really, when you're discussing this, is probably no, largely. The USA and Australia are very big emitters of CO2, as is China and India now. So the fact that they weren't involved is pretty detrimental. Other countries are going to be less likely to stick to the agreement if they feel that big perpetrators like the USA aren't on board. The benefit of it is it kind of paved the way for future agreements. So it was a bit of a test case. It got us started on international agreements. So that's the kind of reason why it is good. So Kyoto expired in 2012. So then we had the Paris Accord in 2015. So this is the agreement here is to reduce CO2 emissions to below 60% of 2010 levels by 2050. The goal is to try and keep warming below 2 degrees. If we go above 2 degrees, we run the risk of permafrost melting. And when that happens, we end up in a positive feedback loop, which we may not be able to stop. So difficulty here is the terms are voluntary, so it wasn't legally binding. Advanced countries are, within this agreement, supposed to transfer money and technology to lower income countries to help them reach the target. So the idea is that you've got countries that are trying to develop, so why don't advanced countries give them the technology such as wind turbines, solar panels, so that they are able to develop in a way that doesn't negatively affect the world, because that affects all of us. So we are getting something. We're not just giving them this stuff, we get something from it too, which is we live in a world where climate change is reduced, basically. So China and India aren't terribly happy about the agreement. They argue that the reductions in CO2 should be basically advanced countries' responsibilities because we have already experienced the benefit and they deserve to sort of experience that benefit too. As you may know, Donald Trump withdrew from the Paris Accord when he became president, so the USA is no longer part of that. But interestingly, because of the nature of the United States being built up of many states that have a lot of autonomy, they have a lot of self-control, some of the states have actually basically stuck to the Paris Accords agreement, even though the country as a whole is not sticking to the Paris Accords agreement. So there is a little bit of a sort of silver lining there, a bit of a benefit. So do you think it's fair that they believe that? Do you think they're right, China and India, to believe that they should get the same opportunities that advanced countries had to develop and grow into a wealthy country? That's sort of up to you what your opinion is. So some alternatives to international agreements instead of using these is a thing called cap and trade. So cap and trade is what's called a market-based approach, meaning that people basically are able to buy and sell the right to emit carbon. Essentially, countries or regions put a cap on the amount of carbon they want to emit. So let's say 100 tonnes a year as an example. And then they give out permits to emit carbon to companies and individuals or what have you. And if a company wants to emit more carbon than they have credits for, they have to buy credits off other companies. And the idea there is, if we imagine a situation where one company starts being much more eco-friendly, they can then make money by selling their carbon credits to less environmentally friendly companies. That way it makes unenvironmentally friendly products more expensive, and it makes sustainable products cheaper. Essentially, that's the idea. So that's all explained here. And so this allows also businesses can also offset their carbon by being involved in schemes like afforestation and renewable energy and wetlands. So this, they can basically pay money for someone to plant trees, and this way they can reduce their carbon footprint. This basically explains how you sometimes see companies claiming to be carbon neutral, particularly companies that are like delivery companies or something like that, and on the side of their vehicle it will say that they're a carbon neutral company, and you kind of think, well, how can a company that owns a fleet of diesel burning vans be carbon neutral? And it's because they pay money for forests to be planted, and this offsets the carbon they emit. So what I want you to do is watch this video. It's a really, really good video for explaining cap and trade. So I want you to take notes on how cap and trade works, and is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Okay. So, and then I want you to basically evaluate which is the best approach. Are international agreements best, or is cap and trade best? So you need to watch the video so that you can really answer this question properly. So write a good paragraph, a long paragraph, outlining which you think is best and why. This is a really important evaluation, okay? So finally, we're on to management strategies to protect the water cycle. So we're really close to the end of the topic now. So there's three different bits we need to cover. So management strategies protecting the water cycle. Now, bear in mind, what we've actually talked about already are also really good strategies for protecting the water cycle. So wetland restoration, as I mentioned, helps protect the water cycle. So do some of the farming practices. So it's not just these points that are some of the points we've looked at for the carbon cycle as well. So there's a whole load of points here about the benefits of forests, some of which we've looked at through the rainforest topic as well. So there's a whole load of ways in which forests help to stabilise regional water cycles. They intercept rainfall, they help secure soil, which means more water is stored in the soil. They slow runoff, so there's loads of different ways that they're beneficial. And as we've already talked about, we've got the RED scheme, which is designed to try and fund projects to and protect forests. Okay, water allocation. So in some countries, water availability is really limited. So water allocation becomes quite a challenging issue. So the biggest consumer of water within a country is actually agriculture. So agriculture uses huge amounts of water, consumes massive amounts of water. And this is because they're using it for things like irrigation and all kinds of processes like this, and it uses masses of water. The next is industry. So factories, power stations, things like that. And then municipal, which is domestic, so home usage. Okay, so actually in people's homes is a really small amount of the water that is being consumed. Just to explain, we've got a thing called water withdrawal and water consumption. Now the only difference between these two is that withdrawing the water, you might withdraw it from a source and then it can then return to that source. Whereas water consumption means it's withdrawn and it doesn't get returned to the source. And the reason that agriculture is so prominent in terms of consumption is that a lot of the water that's put on fields then evaporates and disappears into the atmosphere. So it doesn't then return to the place it's come from. Whereas, say, industry, they might remove water from a river to use for cooling machinery. It's then returned to the river. Now, it's often maybe returned in not quite the same state that it kind of was taken. It might be more contaminated, but it's going back to the same source. So that's the difference between withdrawing and actually consuming water. So these allocations, improving techniques can help to, in farming, can help to reduce the amount of consumption through farming. So there's ways in which we can try and reduce the evaporation that's occurring and reduce over irrigation. So this is things like called mulching. So this is where we put material on the surface. So like organic material from the crops can be left on the surface, and this is mulch, and this helps protect the surface from the sunlight and things like this. We also looked at various things throughout this PowerPoint, things like terracing, contour ploughing. Strips of hedges, again, help to reduce loss of water, and again you can do these along the contours, so that helps to slow water. And then improved processes in terms of recycling water, particularly in developed countries. And so we've got some areas. A good example here is a place called the Lower Indus Valley in Pakistan. So they actually have agreements on how to divide up the available water that's there. All drainage basins in the United Kingdom have a plan in how the water will be used. So if you, say, for example, want to build a new factory in an area, the planning authority will look at the drainage basin plan and decide whether or not your factory fits within the plan. So is it going to be possible for you to reuse the water you want to use without negatively impacting the quality of the water and the amount of water in, say, the groundwater and things like that? Okay. This drainage basin plan can also look at things like planting trees to try and protect the drainage basin in upland areas. It can look at things like gardens and what are called green roofs. This is where you plant plants on the roof of a house or a building, and this helps to reduce runoff. Installing wetlands, all sorts of things like this. All of these are done as part of drainage basin planning to try and protect the water cycle and stop it being damaged. Okay, so like I say, all drainage basins in England and Wales have a plan, and these plans are developed by the Environment Agency and DEFRA, okay, which is Department for Environment, Farming and Rural Affairs, I believe. So this is to, like I say, protect water quality, protect against flooding, things like that. So just to finish all this off, like I said about the global management strategies in general, to what extent do you feel that these strategies can be used effectively to reverse long-term changes in the water and the carbon cycle? So you need to use examples from wetland restoration, afforestation, farming practices, international agreements, and discuss whether these strategies can be used effectively to reverse long-term changes in the water and the carbon cycle. So that brings us to the end of the content for Earth Life Support Systems. Some things you can do to revise this topic is you can do things like create a mind map, which encompasses the whole topic. So bear in mind that the topic is broken down into 4 sections, so that might be a good way of laying the mind map out, is thinking about it in terms of those 4 sections. Some other things you can do is use the specification, go through the specification and use colour coding to highlight which bits you feel confident on and which bits you don't. So that's a good starting point. There are review questions on page 136 of the textbook, and there's also practice exam questions on page 137 of the textbook. And then there are also practice exam questions on Blackboard as well. So all of these are things you can do to review the topic and ensure that you understand it well.